The dust settled on Ruth's worn boots as she stood before the weathered door, her daughter's small hand trembling in hers. 3 days without food had carved hollow spaces beneath Anna's eyes, and Ruth knew that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The single farmer's reputation preceded him, cold, distant, unforgiving, but desperation had brought her to his threshold anyway. When Caleb Morgan opened that door and looked down at them with those steel-grey eyes, Ruth felt something inside her break and mend simultaneously. His words would echo in her mind forever. "You and your child can stay, but only if you're mine." In that moment she realized that sometimes salvation comes wrapped in chains, and the heart must choose between freedom and survival. Subscribe to discover how Ruth's impossible choice transforms into an unexpected journey of love and redemption. The Texas sun had no mercy for those who wandered without purpose, and Ruth Delgado had been wandering for 3 days now. Her feet, swollen and blistered inside boots that had seen too many miles, carried her and Anna down the dusty road that led to the Morgan Ranch. The little girl's steps had grown shorter with each passing hour, her small frame weighed down by hunger and exhaustion that no 6-year-old should ever know. Ruth's own stomach had stopped growling hours ago, replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to echo through her entire being. She had sold everything: her mother's silver cross, the wedding ring from a marriage that had ended in violence, even the small photograph of her grandmother that she had carried across the border. Now, with Anna's hand growing limp in hers, Ruth faced the terrible arithmetic of survival. Pride versus her daughter's life. The Morgan Ranch stretched before them like a mirage of possibility, its weathered buildings standing defiant against the endless horizon. Ruth had heard the stories in town, whispered conversations about the solitary farmer who had inherited this land from his grandfather and had never taken a wife. Some said he was cruel, others claimed he was simply broken by loss, but all agreed on one thing: Caleb Morgan was a man who lived by his own rules. The ranch house, though modest, represented everything Ruth had lost: stability, safety, a place where Anna could sleep without fear. As they approached the front porch, Ruth felt her resolve wavering like heat waves rising from the desert floor. She had rehearsed her words 100 times during their long walk, but now, standing before his door, she realized that no amount of preparation could make this moment easier. The weight of her desperation pressed down on her shoulders like the unforgiving Texas heat. Anna tugged at her mother's skirt, her dark eyes reflecting a weariness that belonged to someone much older. "Mummy, I'm tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that swept across the empty land. Ruth knelt down and smoothed her daughter's tangled hair, fighting back tears that threatened to betray her carefully constructed composure. In Anna's face, she saw echoes of her own childhood. The same stubborn chin, the same eyes that held too much understanding for their years. But she also saw something else: trust. Anna trusted her mother to find a way, to make things right, to transform their nightmare into something bearable. That trust was both Ruth's greatest strength and her heaviest burden, driving her forward even when every instinct screamed at her to turn back. She had failed Anna in so many ways already, failed to keep them safe, failed to provide, failed to protect her from the harsh realities of their situation. The sound of approaching footsteps from inside the house made Ruth's heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. She straightened her shoulders, trying to summon whatever dignity remained in her threadbare dress and dust-covered appearance. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of movement. A tall figure moving with the deliberate pace of a man accustomed to solitude. Ruth's mouth went dry as she realized there was no turning back now. They had been seen, and running would only confirm what everyone already suspected about people like her. She thought of her mother's words, spoken years ago in a kitchen that smelled of fresh tortillas and hope. "Mija, sometimes we must bend so far that we almost break. But if we survive, we become stronger than steel." Those words had carried her across the border, through an abusive marriage, and now to this doorstep where her future hung in the balance. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking shelter from a man when it was a man who had driven her to this desperate state. When the door finally opened, Ruth felt the full weight of Caleb Morgan's gaze settle upon her like a physical force. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of years spent working the land and hands that looked capable of both creation and destruction. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that suggested a man who had known his share of hardship, but it was his eyes that held her attention, grey as storm clouds and just as unpredictable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a chasm that Ruth wasn't sure she could cross. She could feel Anna pressing closer to her side, instinctively seeking protection from this stranger who held their fate in his calloused hands. Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but the words that had seemed so clear during their long walk now felt clumsy and inadequate. "How do you ask a stranger to save your life without sounding like you're begging?" "Mr. Morgan," Ruth finally managed, her voice steadier than she had expected. "My name is Ruth Delgado, and this is my daughter, Anna." She paused, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself, from the place where mothers find strength they never knew they possessed. "We have nowhere else to go, and I'm willing to work, to do whatever it takes, if you'll just give us a chance." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with desperation and hope in equal measure. Ruth watched as Caleb's eyes moved from her face to Anna's, something shifting in his expression that she couldn't quite read. The silence that followed felt eternal, filled with the sound of wind through dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. In that moment, Ruth understood that her entire future and Anna's would be determined by whatever this solitary man decided in the next few heartbeats. Caleb Morgan studied the woman and child standing on his porch with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock at market. Ruth felt his gaze cataloguing every detail, her worn dress, her calloused hands, the way she held herself with a pride that poverty hadn't quite managed to break. There was something in his expression that reminded her of the men who had appraised her father's horses back in Mexico, a calculating look that made her skin crawl even as she forced herself to stand still under his scrutiny. Anna shifted nervously beside her, and Ruth placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the man in the doorway. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to making decisions that others would have to live with. "I've heard about you," he said simply, and Ruth felt her heart sink like a stone thrown into deep water. The stories had reached him first. Stories about the Mexican woman with no papers and no husband. Stories that painted her as either a victim or a threat, depending on who was telling them. "What you've heard," Ruth replied, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised even her, "may not be the whole truth." She had learned long ago that silence in the face of judgment was often mistaken for guilt, and she refused to let this man's assumptions define her before she'd even had a chance to speak for herself. Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his stoic facade, and Ruth caught a glimpse of something that might have been respect flickering in those storm-grey eyes. Anna tugged at her mother's skirt again, and Ruth realized that her daughter was swaying slightly on her feet, exhaustion and hunger finally taking their toll. The sight of her child's weakness gave Ruth a surge of desperate courage that burned away the last of her hesitation. "My daughter needs food and shelter," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Morgan. I'm asking for a chance to earn our keep." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but she forced them out anyway, knowing that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Caleb stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, and Ruth felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. The interior of the house was sparse but clean, furnished with the practical simplicity of a man who had no one to impress. Ruth's eyes took in every detail: the worn leather chairs, the stone fireplace, the kitchen table that looked like it had been built to last generations. It was a home that spoke of solitude and self-sufficiency, a place where a man could live his entire life without needing anyone else. Anna pressed closer to her mother's side, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar surroundings, and Ruth felt a pang of guilt for bringing her daughter into this stranger's domain. But as she watched Caleb move through his kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling bread and milk from his stores, she realized that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected sources. The simple act of watching him prepare food for Anna brought tears to Ruth's eyes, tears she quickly blinked away before he could see them. "Sit," Caleb commanded, his tone brooking no argument, and Ruth guided Anna to one of the wooden chairs at the kitchen table. The little girl's eyes widened at the sight of fresh bread and cold milk, luxuries they hadn't enjoyed in weeks, and Ruth had to resist the urge to snatch the food away and save it for later. Old habits died hard, and the instinct to hoard whatever sustenance they could find had become second nature during their time on the road. As Anna ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, Ruth found herself studying their unlikely benefactor. Caleb moved with the economy of motion that came from years of solitary living, wasting neither time nor energy on unnecessary gestures. There was something almost monastic about his presence, as if he had deliberately stripped away everything that wasn't essential to survival. Yet beneath that austere exterior, Ruth sensed depths that he kept carefully hidden from the world. When Anna had finished eating and was nodding sleepily in her chair, Caleb finally turned his full attention to Ruth. "I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Delgado," he said, and Ruth noticed that he didn't ask whether she was married or not. Perhaps the absence of a wedding ring had already told him everything he needed to know. "This ranch is no place for charity cases or temporary arrangements. If you stay, it will be permanent, and it will be on my terms." Ruth felt her pulse quicken as she waited for him to continue, sensing that whatever came next would change the course of her life forever. Caleb's eyes never left her face as he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "I need a wife, and your daughter needs a father. You can have safety, security, and a home, but only if you're willing to be mine in every sense of the word." The proposition hit Ruth like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her speechless. She had expected him to offer her work as a housekeeper or cook, not marriage to a man she had known for less than an hour. The silence that followed Caleb's proposal seemed to stretch for eternity, filled with the sound of Anna's gentle breathing and the tick of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Ruth's mind raced through her limited options, each one more impossible than the last. She could refuse and take Anna back onto the road, where they would likely starve or worse before finding another opportunity like this one. She could accept and bind herself to a man she didn't know, trading her freedom for her daughter's security. Or she could try to negotiate, though something in Caleb's manner suggested that he was not a man who compromised easily. As she looked at Anna's peaceful face, finally relaxed in sleep after days of fear and hunger, Ruth felt the last of her resistance crumble like sand in the wind. "What exactly are you asking of me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet kitchen. Caleb's expression didn't change, but she caught a flicker of something, satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, in his eyes before he answered with words that would echo in her heart for years to come. "Escriba los capítulos 3 to 5, por favor." The first week passed like a fever dream, each day bleeding into the next, with the strange rhythm of a life that wasn't quite hers. Ruth moved through Caleb's house like a ghost, learning to inhabit flesh again, her hands trembling as she touched his mother's china, her breath catching when she opened closets filled with dresses that had waited decades for a woman's touch. Anna adapted with the frightening resilience of childhood, her laughter echoing through rooms that had forgotten the sound of joy. But Ruth felt the weight of every borrowed moment, every unearned comfort that surrounded them like a beautiful lie. The neighbors came calling on the third day, their eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment, their smiles thin as paper. Mrs. Henderson from the adjacent ranch brought a casserole and stayed for coffee, her gaze cataloguing every detail of Ruth's appearance, every hesitation in her English, every sign that she didn't belong in this world of starched tablecloths and inherited silver. "Such a quick courtship," she murmured, her words dripping with false sweetness. And Ruth felt the familiar burn of shame in her chest, the knowledge that her desperation was written across her face for all to read. Caleb watched these interactions from the doorway, his presence both shield and reminder of the bargain she'd made. He didn't defend her with words, but something in his stillness, in the way his jaw tightened when Mrs. Henderson's voice grew particularly sharp, told Ruth that he understood the cruelty of small-town gossip. When the woman finally left, her casserole untouched and her curiosity unsatisfied, Caleb closed the door with deliberate finality and turned to Ruth with eyes that held an unexpected gentleness. The nights were the hardest, when Anna slept peacefully in her new room and Ruth lay alone in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her. Caleb had been clear about the boundaries. She was his wife in name and necessity, but not in intimacy, not until she chose it freely. The kindness of this gesture warred with her practical mind, which whispered that eventually he would expect more than gratitude and housekeeping. She pressed her face into the pillow that smelled of lavender and old dreams, wondering if she was strong enough to become the woman this house needed her to be. On Sunday, Caleb announced they would attend church together, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. Ruth dressed Anna in the prettiest dress they'd found in the closet, a blue cotton thing with tiny flowers that made her daughter look like a porcelain doll, and chose for herself a simple grey dress that wouldn't draw attention. As they walked up the church steps, Caleb's hand steady at the small of her back, Ruth felt the eyes of the congregation like physical weight, their whispers following her down the aisle like a trail of thorns. The sermon was about redemption, about second chances, and the grace that could transform the most broken soul. But Ruth heard only the undertone of judgment in the preacher's voice, saw only the sideways glances of women who had never known hunger or desperation. When they stood to sing, Anna's clear voice rising above the congregation in perfect, innocent harmony, Ruth felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite hope, but the possibility of it, fragile as a bird's egg and twice as precious. The transformation began with small things. The way Caleb started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table, picked during his morning rides across the ranch, their stems still damp with dew and their petals bright as promises. Ruth would find them there when she came down to make breakfast. Anna already dressed and chattering about the horses she could see from her bedroom window, and something in her chest would flutter like a caged bird testing its wings. She began to arrange the flowers in his mother's crystal vase, her fingers learning the delicate art of beauty for its own sake, and when Caleb saw them there, his smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. Ina bloomed in this new soil, like a desert flower after rain, her laughter growing bolder, her Spanish mixing freely with English, as she chattered to the ranch hands who had taken to spoiling her with carved wooden toys and rides on the gentlest mare. Ruth watched her daughter's transformation with a mixture of joy and terror, knowing that Anna was putting down roots in this place, in this life, in a way that would make leaving impossible. The child called Caleb Papa Caleb now, the words rolling off her tongue with the easy acceptance of youth, and Ruth saw how his face softened each time, how his hands grew gentle when he lifted Anna onto his shoulders to show her the vast expanse of land that might someday be hers. The work of the ranch suited Ruth in ways she hadn't expected, her body remembering rhythms her grandmother had taught her in the mountains of Chihuahua. The careful tending of the vegetable garden, the preservation of food for winter, the mending of clothes and hearts with equal patience. She found herself humming as she worked, old songs her mother had sung, and was surprised when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway one afternoon, his eyes closed and his face peaceful as he listened to melodies that spoke of home and heartbreak in equal measure. My mother used to sing while she cooked, he said quietly, his voice rough with memory. I'd forgotten how much I missed it. Ruth's hands stilled on the massa she was kneading, her heart suddenly too large for her chest, and she understood that they were both orphans in their own way, both searching for something that felt like belonging. When she resumed her humming, it was with the knowledge that she was giving him a gift, as precious as the shelter he'd given her. The sound of life returning to a house that had been too quiet for too long. The evening ritual of Anna's bedtime became sacred ground between them, Caleb reading stories in his careful English while Ruth braided her daughter's hair, their movements synchronized like dancers who had practiced this choreography for years. Anna would drift off to sleep between them, her small hand clutching Caleb's finger while her head rested on Ruth's shoulder, and in those moments Ruth could almost believe they were a real family, bound by love rather than necessity. But reality intruded in the form of immigration officers who came calling on a Tuesday morning, their badges gleaming like threats in the desert sun. Ruth's blood turned to ice as she watched them approach from the kitchen window, Anna playing innocently at her feet, unaware that their fragile peace hung by a thread. Caleb met them at the door, his body a wall between them and the life Ruth had begun to build, his voice steady as he spoke of marriage certificates and legal documents, of rights and protections that existed on paper but felt as insubstantial as morning mist. When they finally left, their questions unanswered and their suspicions unsatisfied, Ruth collapsed into a kitchen chair, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold her coffee cup. Caleb knelt beside her, his large hands covering hers, his voice gentle as he promised that no one would take her away, that he would fight every battle necessary to keep their family safe. And in that moment, Ruth realized that somewhere between the wildflowers and the bedtime stories, between the humming and the shared silences, she had stopped thinking of him as a stranger and started thinking of him as home. 6 months into their arrangement, Ruth woke to find snow dusting the desert like powdered sugar, transforming the harsh landscape into something magical and strange. Anna pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she marveled at her first Texas winter, and Ruth felt the peculiar ache of watching her daughter experience wonder in a place that was becoming, against all odds, truly theirs. Caleb had left early for the cattle, but there was coffee waiting in the pot and a note on the table. "Storm coming. Stay warm. C." And Ruth traced the letters with her finger, amazed at how such simple words could feel like poetry. The storm arrived with the fury of something long suppressed, wind howling across the plains like the voices of all the women who had ever stood at kitchen windows, waiting for their men to come home safe. Ruth moved through the house, lighting oil lamps and checking windows, Anna helping with the solemn importance of a child given real responsibility. And when the power finally failed, they huddled together in the living room, telling stories by firelight while the world raged outside. It was Anna who suggested they wait up for Papa Caleb, her voice small but determined, and Ruth felt her heart crack open a little wider at the love she heard there. He came home near midnight, ice in his beard and exhaustion in every line of his body, and the relief that flooded Ruth's chest was so intense it left her breathless. She helped him out of his frozen coat, her hands steady despite the trembling in her heart, and when he looked at her with eyes that held gratitude and something deeper, something that might have been love, she felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. They sat together by the fire, Anna asleep between them, and talked in whispers about dreams and fears, about the children they'd lost and the hopes they'd buried, about the strange miracle of finding family in the most unlikely places. "I never thought I'd have this again," Caleb said, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "A house full of life, someone to worry about, someone to come home to." His hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers rough from years of hard work, but gentle as they traced the lines of her palm, and Ruth felt herself falling into something that was deeper than gratitude, stronger than necessity, more dangerous than anything she'd ever known, The morning brought clear skies and the kind of silence that follows storms, the world washed clean and gleaming with possibility. Ruth woke in Caleb's arms on the living room sofa, Anna curled between them like a bridge connecting two separate shores. And for the first time since crossing the border, she felt truly safe. They made breakfast together in the kitchen, filled with golden light, Anna chattering about snow angels and hot chocolate, and when Caleb caught Ruth's eye across the table, his smile was like a promise she was finally ready to believe. The immigration officers returned in spring, but this time they found a family that had grown roots too deep to uproot. Legal documents that couldn't be questioned, a marriage that had become real in all the ways that mattered, a child who spoke of her Papa Caleb with the fierce loyalty of blood. Ruth stood beside her husband on the porch, Anna's hand in hers, and watched the officers drive away with the knowledge that some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet persistence of love, the daily choice to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of what came before. As the dust settled behind their departing car, Caleb turned to Ruth with eyes that held the promise of all their tomorrows, and when he kissed her there in the desert sunshine, with Anna giggling at their feet and the vast sky stretching endlessly above them, Ruth tasted freedom on his lips. Not the freedom to run, but the freedom to stay, to choose, to love without fear or reservation, to finally, truly come home.